Welcome back to this Dark Reading Fast Chat series. Terry Sweeney here with Dark Reading, and joining me now is John Morello, CTO of Gutsy. Hey, John, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Terry, thanks for having me.
We are talking about security processes. So let's start with the basic definition. What are we specifically talking about when we're talking about security processes? Can you give us a couple of examples just so that we're all on the same page?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about any security organization, the work that you're doing operationally day to day is really all about processes. Processes really compose almost everything that you do in security. Think about everything from creating user accounts, providing them access to the resources and data that they need. When somebody departs the organization, removing their access, removing the user account, or with vulnerabilities, you detect vulnerabilities, you triage them, you test an update for that, you build the update, you deploy the update, or an incident, you detect an incident, you triage that detection, you take some actions to contain or to remove the incident. Really everything that you're doing in security is about, getting some kind of signal and taking some kind of action on it, which is really all about process.
Thanks. That's actually really helpful. From there, can we then talk about why it's important with cybersecurity to prioritize how we address human error and failed processes rather than just continuing to add more tools to the security arsenal?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the history in our industry, at least over the past 25 years that I've been involved with it, a lot of the answers that have been given to any kind of security problem that people have had has been some kind of new technology or tool to purchase to try to remediate or identify those problems. And that's resulted in this situation where people have many tools. When we talk to CISOs, they often tell us they have 50 or 80 different security tools, wow, but they struggle just to operationalize those and to get the outcomes that they want. And when I say outcomes, we just talked about processes. Think about for vulnerability management as an example. The outcome that you want is not to detect vulnerabilities. The outcome you want is to detect the vulnerability and then to fix it, right? Same thing with incidents. The goal is not just to find that you have an incident. The goal is to contain and to remove that incident. But for that to happen, it's the end result of a process. Again, with vulnerabilities, you detect it, you triage it, you get some update for that, you test that, you deploy that. It's a sequence of things that typically traverses many different technologies, many different teams. And for you to get that outcome, all of those things have to work together. And if you think about security just from the context of like, hey, I have all of these different tools as kind of isolated things that work on their own, it's really hard to make them work together to give you that outcome. So the importance to answer your question about process, a process-centric view of things, that if you don't look at security as a series of interconnected systems and events that deliver outcomes, then it's hard for you to get those outcomes in the end. So what we're saying is, if you look at and think about the process and how those things work together, what are all the various detours, what are the delays that occur within the process, you can really understand the things that prevent or delay you from getting those outcomes that you want.
Okay. With that in mind, what do you tell customers or prospective customers who may not understand how all their processes work, let alone which processes they may have already in place?
Well, I mean, the question you ask is actually it's a really timely one, a really relevant one, I guess, because that actually is the reality for a lot of customers. When we talk to people, a lot of times they'll tell us like, all this sounds great. It seems like it would be very useful, but I don't even know how this process works today, or I don't even know, what we do when somebody leaves the organization. That doesn't mean that there's not value, though, in understanding the process, because one of the things that's really cool and really useful about the application of process mining to security is that you don't have to know how it works beforehand. The real value with process mining is, as long as you just know the systems that are involved, and maybe not even a complete view of those, but some of the primary systems that are involved, we'll connect to those things. We'll pull out the data, the events of what they're doing individually, and then we'll be able to correlate those activities and show you how they work together, or, unfortunately, maybe how they don't really work well together, where the delays are, where the detours are in that path. But you don't have to have this pre-existing complete knowledge of the way the process works to really be able to start getting value from it. And in fact, for a lot of people, that lack of knowledge and understanding is really one of the best values that they give. It's just to know how things already are working, even if that's not desirable or optimal. It at least gives you a place to start from and to identify like what's the most important improvements that you need to make.
Okay. Given the regular waves of new threats that are constantly upon us, not to mention the tools to address them, talk a little bit about how customers can organize their own processes to secure, say, things like Internet of Things, the boom in virtual assets, that sort of thing. Not to mention just the constant stream of new and emerging threats.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think all of those things, again, in security, almost everything ends up being a process. So you think about emerging and new threats. Well, what do you do today if there is some new threat that you think may impact your organization? Let's say there's a new O-Day vulnerability that comes out and it's for common software that you probably use. Well, how would you go about addressing that today? Probably you'd have some process in which you learn about the fact that this vulnerability exists, right? And then you'll try to assess what your current environment has, whether or not you have exposures to that. Once you figure out what that exposure is, you'll try to determine what action you want to take. Maybe in an extreme circumstance, you want to like block access to those systems or turn them off or disconnect them. Most of the time instead, you probably would say, okay, we're going to start deploying a patch on this day or making a configuration change, whatever is necessary to remediate that vulnerability. You'd plan that, you'd schedule it, you'd do it, you'd validate that it was done properly, you'd validate that you'd actually close the vulnerability. Well, what did I just describe to you? It's a process, right? But you don't know how effective that process is in giving you those outcomes unless you have a way to really see into the process. All those different systems we just described, not just the technology systems, but the tools and the teams that are using those systems. In a lot of organizations today, security leaders have really put a lot of trust into their managed security service providers and managed detection and response providers to do a lot of the work that historically might have even been done in-house is now done by a vendor. And while that provides a lot of great capabilities and staff augmentation benefits, it just is more sort of complexity in that process. And so again, if you don't understand how all those services and teams and tools are working together, you can't identify where the delays are. And so, going back to our example, let's say that you go through all this process, and at the end of that, you've only fixed half of the systems that are vulnerable. And somebody says, well, why didn't you fix the other half? If you don't understand the process, it's hard to answer that. If you do, you can say, okay, we're waiting on an approval from this team, or we still haven't gotten the results from this tool that's trying to assess this part of our environment. That kind of visibility is really critical into improving that outcome and being able to deliver it more quickly.
Okay. John, it strikes me that an example here would be really helpful in just really being able to visualize some of the concepts that we're talking about here. Can you just give us an example of maybe a recent customer who optimized their own resources and how process issues came into that equation, not to mention the solution?
Yeah, I'll give you a good example. We were working with a large organization in the U.S. that was heavily AWS centric. This organization worked with a lot of software development contractors, both to build externally facing apps and things that face their own employee and staff population. Well, as you know, I mean, AWS and the other cloud providers have really sophisticated, capable IAM services. You can be very discreet and specific about what access people have and so forth. But with that sophistication comes complexity, right? Like if you start really trying to be sophisticated, there inevitably means that there's more complexity in that. So this organization was really struggling with saying when one of these contractors left, were they fully removing all the access they had? And they had seen situations in the past where that had not occurred, where people still had access even after they should no longer. But what is that process for removing access? Well, there was a signal from the HR system that said this person's contract is left. They would need to go to a directory service. Then there was an accounts management team that took a variety of things, were both manual and automatic steps to remove the user's access. When they used Gutsy to connect to all those various systems, the HR system, the ticket managing system, the cloud providers involved with it, and we could pull in all the information about what each one of those steps in the process was doing, we stitched all that together and could show them where the detours and delays were on that. And specifically, one of the really interesting things we were able to show them was there was a step that was being done manually by their accounts management team that basically provided access or removed access to the various AW accounts that they had. But because that was a manual process, what they were able to see was about 10% of the time when they were removing someone, the accounts management team just made a mistake. They just overlooked or trying to do too many things, whatever, and they forgot to remove them from one of the accounts that they had access to, which then allowed them, to continue to have access to data and to services and systems that were there. The really cool thing with Gutsy, though, was not just showing them that problem. It's because we had all the data about the specific users and the times and the teams that were involved with that. Their CISO was able to use that data to be able to make the case to their CIO. This is something we need to invest in automating. There is a clear ROI in that. Not only can we save in number of hours that Gutsy could help measure that they were spending there, but we could also say, look, we're going to reduce the risk here because we can make sure that this removal of an account that today is being done manually and has a fairly significant error rate, we can make that error rate zero by doing it completely through automation. And so the really powerful thing is not just the visibility and understanding, but the fact that it's so data oriented allows you to try to drive for change within the organization. And actually, that's why we call the company Gutsy, is like we want to give you the data and the knowledge to be able to answer hard questions and make tough decisions, do gutsy things. And you can't do that if you don't really have a clear understanding of what the current state of the environment is.
Nice. John, in just a few minutes we have left, can you talk a bit about specific methodologies or frameworks that Gutsy uses to help organizations rethink their own cybersecurity process problems rather than as a technology problem?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of different frameworks and standards and so forth that are available that are really well thought out and provide a great reference and structure for organizations to try to adapt their own processes too. But if you don't have an understanding of how you're actually doing it and what it looks like in kind of an optimal state, it's hard to make that transition. So I'll give you like one example of one of the things we do. Vulnerability management is a very common thing. I mean, basically everybody has to manage vulnerabilities, right? But lots of people have different approaches and different ways that they do that. Some processes may be more, consistent and sophisticated and refined. Other organizations, it's much, much less so. It's much more sort of scattershot and ad hoc how they do it. But regardless, there's some great guidance that exists in a very kind of academic open source manner that's provided by NIST in their 800-40 special publication about how to do vulnerability management. One of the things that Gutsy enables you to do is to look at how you're doing it today. What is like the data actually show about how you're doing it today in one pane, and then how does it look when NIST is referring to, or how does NIST recommend whether doing it in 800-40, and literally be able to compare the two side by side and say, are we missing a critical step here? Should we be doing this triage part of the process more quickly? Is that what the best practice is? How does other organizations, how do they perform this same kind of attack, response to an attack or response to a vulnerability? That ability to compare is really key.
Excellent. I'm just thinking that the beauty of this is it embraces both the meta and the minutia. You're really bringing these together under the umbrella of process management. So
that's right.
Intriguing. Really appreciate you doing this fast chat with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Terry. I appreciate it.
We've been talking with John Morello, CTO of Gutsy. This has been Terry Sweeney for this Dark Reading Fast Chat. We'll see you next time.